sex. Okay, now, when you look at a lot of damage that's been done in people's lives, often it comes from sex, sexual intercourse, sexual things. When you look at some of the black eyes that it seems like has happened in the body of Christ, usually it's different things about sex and abusive sex and ungodly activities and covenant breaking, etc. Okay, now, one of the things that you look at, there's a plethora of information about sex, but there's very little of it that comes from the church. And so a lot of people, their only source of information has been ungodly. And so because of that, they've had a lot of damage in their lives. And they've even caused a lot of damage to other people's lives. Now, the Bible is not silent on sexual intercourse. It's not silent. And so we're not going to be silent either, okay? So we look at the origin and purpose of sexual intercourse. The first thing we're going to look at, the creator of sexual intercourse is God. Let's go to the beginning, Genesis, the book of beginnings, 1:27. Here, when he first made man, it says, so God created man in his own image. And so we know God is a spirit, we're a spirit, but also God has a head, neck, arms, legs, torso, etc., okay? God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female. He created them what? Them, okay? So when God created mankind, he created male and female. Now, one of the multitude of false doctrines that go on about God, you know, anytime you hear it talking about the feminine side of God, or some people erroneously say, oh, God is a woman, you know, all of that stuff, a movie that came out a couple of years ago, some people were saying, well, you know, they really saw some good points in there, but you have to understand it's blasphemy in that they were portraying God as a female. Okay, now, when God created us, mankind, he created us in his likeness and in his image. Now, he created us male and female. Now, God is not female, but females are basically a man or mankind with a what? Womb. Why is that? Because he goes on to say, and then he says, and he blessed them, and God said to them, what? Be fruitful and multiply. Now, so the way that human beings be fruitful and multiply is through sexual intercourse. When, you know, the sperm gets together with the egg. Now, what happens? Two men cannot be fruitful and multiply. Two women cannot be what? Fruitful and multiply. And so God is the one that created sexual intercourse, okay? And then it goes on, and it says, are we just going down to, 28. And then he says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over everything that moves on the earth, okay? So when God created us, he created us male and female. He gave us the commission to be fruitful and multiply, and that's why he was the creator of sexual intercourse. And then also what you see, he gave us dominion over everything but each other. Okay? Now, so what's the purpose of sexual intercourse? One of them we just kind of alluded to, but we're going to look at four of them here. The first is the entering and exiting of the marriage covenant. What you have to understand, sexual intercourse is a covenant act for marriage. Once you say your vows, and you know, whether you do it in church or whether you do it in the courthouse, okay, and you're legally married, well, then what's supposed to happen? You're supposed to consummate that marriage, okay? And so that sexual act of sexual intercourse, what happens? That's the act that does what? Consummates the marriage, or that begins the marriage covenant. Now, a lot of times people don't understand where we're going. We're going to go to Matthew 19:4. They don't understand how God says the only reason for divorce that he would really approve of is sexual immorality, or what we would call adultery. Okay, so you're married to one person, you're having sexual intercourse with another. Why? Because sex in and of itself is what? A covenant act for marriage. And once you get married, that's when you're supposed to enter into that marriage covenant, a sexual intercourse. And then while you're married, if one of the persons decides to get into adultery and they have sex with someone else, well, they have what? They've broken the marriage covenant. And so that other person, they have the ability to just walk, get a divorce, leave. Why? Because the covenant's already broken. Now, what happens is we are not allowed not to forgive. We should forgive. But because sexual intercourse is what? it's a covenant act in marriage. That's how the marriage was supposed to be entered into, and that's how the marriage covenant can be what? Broken. And what is God? He's a covenant-keeping God. So even though it doesn't seem like a big deal to us, it's a big deal to him. And one of the reasons it doesn't seem like a big deal to us is because a lot of people, their first sexual experiences were not a big deal. It wasn't covenant, it wasn't godly, it wasn't right. And that's why a lot of women, having sexual intercourse with their husbands, they have a problem with it. They don't see how it's really that necessary or they just say, well, he's just trying to use me. Why? Because their first sexual experiences were with men that were just trying to use them to fulfill their own lust. It was outside of marriage. Okay, let's go on. Let's go to Matthew 19:4. And here it says, and he answered and said to them, have you not read what he who made them at the beginning, which was God, made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother. And one of the things that happens when you have your parents, your mother or your father in your marriage, you're setting your marriage up for failure. And be joined to his wife, okay? And so now they're what? They're becoming one. They're entering into a covenant with each other, and the two shall be one flesh, the bonding. So then they are no longer two, but they are what? One. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Verse 7. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? Now, understand this. Women in that Eastern culture, they had no rights whatsoever, so they could not divorce their husbands. Their husbands could give them a certificate of divorcement and divorce them. And he said, now, if this is the way God sees it, why did he allow Moses to do it? And he goes on to say, verse 8, and he said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts. We call it irreconcilable differences. The Bible calls it hardness of heart. When you just shut down, you get frustrated. You don't want to be a part of this anymore. And you're not forgiving. You're full of bitterness. And so now people just want to leave. What was it? Hardness of heart. Permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whosoever divorces his wife except for one thing, sexual immorality. Why would that be? Sexual intercourse is how that marriage covenant was entered into after you said your vows. And so what happens is that's the way it can be what? Broken. Once a person gets into adultery, they break the marriage covenant. The other person has the opportunity to walk divorce if they want to. Of course, we're called to forgive, but you don't have to. And one of the biggest problems that happens in marriage is people never pray before they get in it. So you need to take time to pray before you get out of it too. And then it goes on, and I say unto you, whosoever divorces his wife, we just read, except for sexual immorality and marries another, commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. Okay, now, God is what? He's a covenant-keeping God. And so sex is what? A covenant act for marriage, okay? So now, you have this wedding, or you go before the judge, but you do something, you get legally married, okay? And then that night, what's supposed to happen is that you have sexual intercourse for what? The first time. And what happens is you're now entering into that marriage covenant. Now, we know that there are a lot of times, and what I'm saying is, even if you were not a virgin when you got married, when you get married, you're supposed to be the first time you're having sexual intercourse with that person. Now, we have this worldly mentality that we allow to supersede the Word of God. And so what happens is we say, okay, this is what we say, well, let's take our relationship to the next level, which means what? Let's become whoremongers. Okay? That's not God. And they say, well, I just want to know. I just want to make sure that it's right. Look at all the people that got divorced that were into premarital sex anyway. You can't find out if it's right just by getting involved in sin before marriage. And then it goes on. Then there's a lot of people that, yeah, they were sexually active with one another before they got married. But once they get married, the real them comes out. She's had all these sexual experiences with men that she was not married to. So she feel like when people are having sex with her, they're using her. So now she's married. She don't want to have sex. He has been involved in so many different sexual relationships, he's not really interested in her because he wants more variety. Or he's been involved in masturbation, or he's been involved in pornography so long, a real woman doesn't really do it for him like the women in pornography. But before they got married, they were sexually active. Why? Because they were trying to get each other. Okay, so it's the entering the exit of the marriage covenant. Now, I'm not going to turn there for time's sake, but you have it in your outline, Deuteronomy 22, 16, and 17. And so what happens is, what was supposed to happen, you got one man who was a virgin marrying one woman who was a virgin. And that woman, you know, usually she would still have a hymen. Sometimes a woman could be born without one, or it could get broken doing anything, riding a boy's bike and you slip off. It'd break any kind of way. But let's just say that they, you know, so she was supposed to have a hymen. And so when they got married, they'd have these big weddings. And then their reception would literally last days. But what would happen is when the couple got together after the marriage vows, and they got together, went to their tent or whatever they went to, and they would have sexual intercourse for the first time, entering into that marriage covenant. Well, the penis would penetrate the vagina, but would have to first break the hymen. Drops of blood would come out, and so the blood that was on those sheets would be given to her parents, and that was her proof of virginity. So if later on he was trying to get out, well, she wasn't right, she was active before, you know, she wasn't really a virgin when you gave it to me, they'd go before the people in town and say, here's our proof of our daughter's virginity. Okay? Because what? Marriage originally was supposed to be a blood covenant for life. Let's go on. So, with this B, the purpose of sexual intercourse, the second thing we're looking at is bonding, to bond the couple together. Let's go to Genesis 2 and 24. Genesis 2 and 24. And so when you look at Genesis 2 and 24, what are you seeing here? Genesis 2 and 24 is that sometimes when people get angry with each other, the first thing they want to do, well, they don't want to get intimate with one another. That's the worst thing they can do. Because what happens is we have the sexual intercourse where you continuously bonding together, okay? And you have more of a desire, you know, you constantly be bonded because, okay, like we stuck together for life anyway, let's work this thing out. Okay? And it says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother. You see it over and over and over. God is speaking what? You got to get your parents out your business. You got to see yourself not only as the daughter or the son, you have to see yourself as this is our family unit. You don't have to have children to have a family unit. All you have to do is have a marriage, and this is your family. Your spouse, you and your spouse, that is your what? Your family. You're starting a new what? Family unit, okay? And then it goes on. Man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become what? One flesh. How do they become one flesh? Through sexual intercourse. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. And so what were they doing? They were cleaving, bonding to one another. It talks about how the husband is supposed to what? Cleave to his wife. And they're bonding through what? Sexual intercourse. Okay? Now, so what happens is because God created sexual intercourse for marriage, and it's part of the marriage covenant, and part of what it does, it bonds the couple together. Well, it bonds you together with people you're not married to too. It's called a sexual tie. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 6 and 16. 1 Corinthians 6 and 16. First Corinthians 6 and 16, and here it actually states, it says, our heating system sounds like a musical instrument, doesn't it? Or do you not know that he who is joined to a harlot, how? Through sexual intercourse, is one body with her, for the two, he says, become one flesh. Well, how do the two become one flesh? Through bonding, through sexual intercourse. And so I've heard some people falsely teach that a soul tie, you get into a soul tie when you have sexual intercourse with a person. That's a lie. People have sexual intercourse with a person, they don't even know their name, don't care to know their name. Okay, and so that's not, brings about a sexual tie through having sexual intercourse with somebody that you don't care about, you don't know about, like I said, don't even know or remember her name or care to know it, or his name or whatever. It's usually her name. But anyway, and so what happens is, because of what God created sex for, part of the purpose is what? To bond that couple together in that marriage covenant, okay? Let's look at the other thing, pleasure. Let's go to Genesis 18 and 10. Genesis 18 and 10. 18 and 10. And here it simply says, 18 and 10, it says, And he says, and this was when the angels came and talked to Abraham, and he says, I will surely return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. Now, you remember the first time God gave Abraham a promise that he would have a son, he wasn't specific, but he just assumed Abraham knew, well, if this is you married to, this is who the child is going to come from. So after 10 years, when, what's her name, Sarah, being in the Canaanite area, because among the Canaanites, and, you know, she was bearing even as a young woman, okay? But being among the Canaanites, they had this thing where if you were unable, a wife was unable to produce a son for her husband, now we know scientifically, well, the wife wasn't the one that was responsible for the gender, the man was anyway, okay? But if a wife could not produce a son for her husband, well, then she can get a surrogate, okay? And so that's exactly what Sarah did. And then, of course, Abraham, what? He co-signed it. He got involved with her. And then they had an Ishmael. They had a son that was outside of God's will, outside of their marriage. And you see today, the seed of Abraham, as far as Ishmael and Isaac, they're fighting and at each other's throat today. And see, a lot of times we don't know a lot of things that we do outside of God's will sexually brings confusion and strife for generations. And then it goes on, and it says, and Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Of course, even when she was younger, she was barren. She couldn't bear children. But now, as far as a regular woman, she was past the age of childbearing. Therefore, Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, and my Lord also? And so what you have to understand is that, you know, so they had probably stopped having sexual intercourse, because even when she had died, she was 125. Abraham had to go to where she was, you know, so they weren't necessarily what we would term living together as they got older or whatever, or totally living together. And usually, you know, the wife or whatever be in this tent, the husband be in that tent. When he wanted to go see her, he would, or, you know, whatever. But anyway, so what happens is they saw it as pleasure. And so it says, and then it says, therefore Sarah laughed within herself, I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also. We just read it, and then it goes on down to, well, that's as far as we're going to go on that. Let's look at procreation. The purpose of sexual intercourse, for the entering and exiting of marriage, because it's part of the marriage, it's a marriage covenant act. B, bonding. C, pleasure. 3, procreation. Let's go to Genesis 4:1. Genesis 4:1. And it says, now Abraham knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. And then she bore again, and this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now in 4:1 of Genesis, it says Adam knew Eve. When you run reference on that word, it would refer to what we call sexual intercourse. They had sexual intercourse with one another, and they would use the term knowing them, okay? Now, let's go on. So let's look at the counterfeit, destructive purposes of sexual intercourse. Because, you know, anytime there's a real, often there's going to be a false or a counterfeit. And usually the false and counterfeit comes from the demonic, and it also brings damage into people's lives. And so the first is what? Sexual lust. Sometimes men will ask, they really love their wives, and they're greatly sexually attracted to their wives, and they'll say, well, is it all right to lust after my wife? No, because you have to understand what lust is. It's wonderful to have a really strong sexual desire for your wife. That's wonderful. But lust is lust is always selfish, is a selfish sexual desire that has disregard for the good of the one who is the object of the lust. You're not concerned about their well-being. You're not concerned about honoring them. You're not concerned about protecting them, caring for them. You're just concerned about what? Getting your lust fulfilled. Let's see the example. Let's go to 2 Samuel 13:1. 2 Samuel 13:1. 13:1, and here it states, 2 Samuel 13:1, and it says, after this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar, okay? And Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Now, Absalom and Tamar had the same father and mother. David was their father, and they had the same mother. Amnon, David was his father as well, but he had a different mother than who Tamar and Absalom had. And so they were what we would term step brothers and sisters, okay? Now, and it says David loved her. If you have a Greek lexicon, when you look it up in the Greek lexicon, what you'll find out, the word here, ahav, is different verses, different chapters, different books. It means different things in the Old Testament. In this book, chapter, verse, it means pure lust. So what did he have? He had a selfish sexual desire that had disregard for the good of the object, who was that his stepsister Tamar, that had disregard for the good of the one who is the object of his lust, okay? So what did he do? We're not going to take time to read the whole thing. He got with his first cousin. His first cousin gave him a scheme. He worked it out, and he raped her. Right when he was about to rape her, she begged him, please, please don't do this to me. You can just go to our father. You can go to the king, which was both of their fathers. They were stepbrother and sister. You can just go to the king and ask for my hand in marriage, and he'll do it. Amnon didn't want to hear any of that because he didn't care anything about her. He just had what? He had a strong lust. And lust is always what? Selfish, sexual desire for her that he wanted fulfilled immediately. Okay? And so, because even in verse 2, it says, Amnon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick. You know those people, when I just can't, I can't stop thinking about her. I can't eat, I can't sleep, blah, blah, blah. For she was a virgin, and it was improper for Amnon to what? Do anything to her. See, lust just wants to do something, get his selfish sexual desire fulfilled, but it's not concerned about the betterment or the welfare of the object of lust. So in his mind, it looked like love. I can't eat, can't sleep. I'm just thinking about this beautiful woman. I got to have her. But it was nothing but what? Lust. And so even though she said that, he didn't want to hear it. He just went ahead and raped her. And it damaged her life because the last thing you see, she just left because after he raped her, he put her out. And once he put her out, he had the servants to lock the door after her. And she took off her, I guess, like whatever the virgin's outfit that she wore. And she just ran to her brother Absalom's house. And she stayed there the rest of her life. You never heard anything else about her because she was so damaged. And a lot of women, they really, you know, they say because they want to get married, they say they don't really have a problem sexually, but they are very damaged because sex was forced on them at some point as a child or in some other relationships or in their sexual relationships. What had happened is that the people, you know, they were dating someone. You know how they say, well, let's take our relationship to the next level, which means what? Let's become whoremongers, okay? And so what happens is now she has sexual intercourse with him, and he dumps her. After that, she never hears from him again. Now she's running after, what did I do wrong? Well, one, you're not supposed to have sex with somebody you're married to, but that you have to understand, he never loved you. He never cared for you. His motivation in pursuing you was his selfish sexual desire for you called lust. All right? B, you're still looking at the counterfeit destructive purposes of sexual intercourse. Sodomy, which is sexual intercourse involving anal and oral copulation between heterosexuals or homosexuals. Let's go to Genesis 19:4. And this is what happens. You know, people feel like, well, it's all right for me to do oral anal sex because I'm not a homosexual and I'm heterosexual and I'm doing it with my wife. Okay, now, understand this. Wrong is wrong. And so if that's sodomy, and the Bible condemns sodomy, you're not supposed to be doing it. Now, I mean, after morning service and after prayers, like the nurses, you know, most of them retired, they just surrounded me with all this information. But what I was saying, which is true, but they had even additional information than what I had, what happens is because your mouth was never created to be a sexual organ, the skin is much thinner in your mouth than it is in your other places, yeah, and so what in your sexual organs. And so what happens is you can get diseases having oral sex that you could not get if you were just, you know, the penis was penetrating the vagina in sexual intercourse, okay? Because it wasn't created to be that. And so a lot of men, you know, they're getting like throat cancers and things like that from what? Sodomy. They're having oral sex with their wife. And if she has I guess it's the Papillonian virus or something like that, and she doesn't know it. And what happens is, so he's having oral sex with her, which is sodomy. What happens is that can cause throat cancer. And then they were saying that a lot of the things that a woman might cleanse or refresh herself with, if a man is performing oral sex on her, which is sodomy, now he's getting those chemicals, and it can cause other diseases as well. Because it was never God's way. And it came out of the darkness of perversion. And the real people that really have a problem with it, because even when they knew the Lord, they were involved in fornication, and they were involved in sodomy. So now that they're married, I'm not going to stop. Because you didn't honor God in your singleness, so you figure, why am I honor God on your unmarried statement? Why am I honor God in my married statement? My statement. And so, and then too, you look at anal sex. Okay, that's where people have bowel movements for them. How gross is that? And then you look at oral sex. That's where people urinate from. How gross is that? And so it has to be a spirit of perversion that's even making that look good to you. But you don't know. It's tremendous. It's tremendous sexual sin and perversion. Okay, and so let's go to Genesis 19:4. 19:4. People having to go to emergency room with anal sex because nothing that big was supposed to come in their behind. I mean, it's all kind of stuff that happens that people don't talk about. But it's perversion because God never created that for sexual intercourse. That's a part of perversion. It's called sodomy, okay? Genesis 19:4. And here it simply says, and the people get the throat cancer. Well, I never smoked. No, you didn't, but you was doing something else. You was in sodomy. 4. And it says, now, before they lay down, the men of the city, so what was going on? Abraham had just negotiated. It was like 3 angels. One of them probably was Jesus, but anyway, the other 2 were angels. And so the one he negotiated with was God. He left, and then you had the other 2 angels, okay? Now, so with the other 2 angels, what happens is, so they're coming down to Sodom and Gomorrah to check it out. Because Abraham just negotiated with God. If I can find 10 righteous, he won't destroy it, okay? And so they were out there, and it was getting dark, and Lot saw him. Lot knew how wicked that city was. And he said, hey, you all can't stay here. No, they said, no, we want to stay out. And he strongly persuaded them, come into my house. You can't stay out here at night. And so they came into Lot's house. And once they came into Lot's house, that's where we're picking up, 19:4. And here it states, it says, now, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. So this was all the men that practiced that perversion, old and young. And they called to Lot and said to him, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out that we may know them. Okay, then in italics was added as carnally. When you see the word know, it's the same word that was used, K-N-O-W. It's the same Hebrew word that was used in Genesis 4:1 when Adam knew Eve. So they're talking about what? Sexual intercourse. So they talk about knowing them sexually. Okay, now, so since these are men and they're trying to get at the men visitors, nobody has a vagina. And so they're looking at sodomy, oral or anal. This is both sodomy. Okay, now, so what happens? So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, please, my brethren, do not do so what? Wickedly. Sodomy, oral sex, anal sex is what? Wicked, even if it's you and your wife or you and your husband. It's wicked. See now, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. And so what did he know? What was it? They were just going to perform sodomy on the daughters, oral, anal. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof. He said, in essence, what he was saying, I knew how wicked and perverted you all were. I knew all you all were into sodomy. And so what happens is, or oral and anal sex, and so I persuaded them to come under the protection of my roof. And now you're trying to tear down my door to get to them. And so I'm trying to protect them. Here, take my daughters. Now, for the Western mind, this seems really strange. Why would Lot be willing to give his daughter? Because we have what? A Western mind. In Eastern culture, they disvalued women. Even probably in some places today in the East, if a family was really struggling, like, really poor, poverty, etc., or whatever, and they had little children, some boys and girls, and they didn't have enough food for the whole family, what they would do is they take the boys aside away from the girls and feed them. And they wouldn't feed the girls because they didn't have enough food for everybody. And you see that throughout the Bible. Now, what do we know about the Bible? The Bible truly records what people said and did, but that doesn't mean what people said and did was God's will. And that's why people get into error and confusion. Oh, they did that in the Bible? Well, because they did that. Well, Amnon just raped his half-sister. That means we're supposed to rape, if you got a half-sister, you're supposed to rape her? No, it doesn't mean that. People did all kind of vile things in the Bible. We're not to follow what people said and did. The Bible just records accurately what people said and did. If you want to know God's will, go to what did God say and what did God do. God never devalued women. When when they had got to the promised land, they're about to divide up the when they got somewhere, anyway, Moses, they were about to divide up the land. And so what happened was anyway, and so with Moses, so there were 5 daughters who their father was not in the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, but their father was dead. And so what happens is these girls were saying, because it was unheard of for women to get inheritance, because in the Eastern culture, women were nothing. Okay? And they asked Moses, Moses, can we have our dad's inheritance? Moses said, okay, let me go ask God. Let me go find out. If you want to know the will of God, go through the Old Testament and New Testament to see what God said, not what people did, and not what people said. And so Moses came back, and he said, God said you can marry whoever you want to. Only they have to be in the same tribe so the inheritance doesn't get passed on to another tribe. Okay? He empowered women where they can even just marry whoever they want to. And see, what you have to understand, this was empowering as well, because even in the East, even today, where they have arranged marriages, a girl, she can be a Christian, or the family can even be Christian. And because they're so part of that culture, possibly whoever's the head, whether it's the father or the older brother, they might marry her off to a man who is a Muslim, not even a Christian, because of the financial wherewithal that he has. Okay? And so if you really want to know God's will, go to his literal words. Okay? And so Eastern culture, they could not have inheritance. God said they can have it. It's just when they marry, make sure they marry within their tribe so that inheritance doesn't go into a different tribe. Okay? And so we go on. And so so we're looking at that, and so when we saw that, that was what? That's where we get the word sodomy from, the anal and oral sex that was practiced in that area. Okay, now, so let's go to Jude 1:7. Jude only has one chapter. It's the last book of the Bible, and we're going to look at the 7th verse. Jude 1:7, and here it simply says, as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in the similar manner to these, having given themselves over to what? Sexual immorality, and gone after what? Strange flesh. What strange flesh? Oral and anal sex. Your mouth was never supposed to be a sexual organ. Or set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. C. We're still looking at counterfeit and destructive purposes of sexual intercourse, fornication, and adultery. Let's go to Hebrews 13:4. Hebrews 13:4, and here it simply says, it says, marriage is honorable among all. Now, so people use this scripture and they say, well, it's all right for me and my wife to be involved in sodomy, oral and anal sex, because the Bible says the marriage bed is undefiled. That's when, if it hasn't been something else that the Bible, if the Bible has already called it sin, it's still sin whether you do it in the marriage bed or not. That's why over the years the homosexuals, as well as as health benefits, but other reasons too, but homosexuals are really fighting to get the ability to marry. When you look at statistics, they definitely are not, faithful to one another. Okay? But what happens is they stay on this, well, okay, we're homosexuals, and so we're married now, so we're in the marriage bed. Whatever we do is right. If God has already condemned homosexual activity, in the Old Testament. It says mankind shall not sleep with mankind as with womankind. And then in New Testament, it talks about, in Romans, the 1st chapter, women doing those things against nature with one another, and men burning in their lust burning in lust one towards another. It's already condemned. So once you put a ring on it, once you get a marriage license, that still doesn't make it right. And so if God has already condemned oral and anal sex through the book of Genesis, Sodom and Gomorrah, and then you also see it in Jude, the 7th verse, well, what happens is doing it with a ring on and a marriage license don't make it right, because he's already called it sin. And it says what? Marriage is honorable law, the bed is undefiled, but fornicators, people involved with sexual intercourse, well, we're just going to take our relationship to the next level. No, it's sin, because you're not supposed sex is a covenant act, and you're not supposed to have sexual intercourse with anybody outside of a marriage covenant, okay? But fornicators and adulterers, well, my husband, he's mean, so it's all right for me to get a man on the side. My wife, she won't give me any sexual intercourse, and so I need to get me a woman on the side. You can't find that. You're still under the judgment of God, because you're not supposed to do it. And it says what? But fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. Final thing, then we're going to go into the funny. I think you need to laugh about now. We're going to go into the funny DVD, okay? Final point. We're still looking at the counterfeit and destructive purposes of sexual intercourse. Final thing is masturbation and pornography, all right? And they did not put the scriptures on here. They cut it off, but I know it's in Matthew. I think it's in 558, 528. Okay, on the one I have, it's cut off. Okay, 5 and 28. Matthew 5 and 28. And, I love when people ask me things, and often I share it. I never expose who might have asked me, because that's not what it's about. And I usually will say something, because I know if one person asks something, usually there's inquiring minds who want to know. Somebody asked me, well, and it wasn't anybody in our church, since you have been unmarried for so long, how do you take care of yourself? And I knew what they was talking about. They were talking about sexually, okay? And so I told them about Matthew 5 and 28. Now I'm going to read it, okay? And it calls it sin. And so let me just go to this point, because then we'll be finished. Okay, and so what happens is, as we're reading, we'll see that masturbation, pornography, all of that stuff, that is sin. You're not supposed to be doing it. And so what happens is, I don't listen to music or watch movies and videos that are sexual, okay? I kind of set the lead at PG-13. Okay, generally. And because I'm not watching people have sexual intercourse on TV and all that other stuff, not only because I'm not married, but the second reason is that's kind of perversion. It's just like your neighbor saying, hey, about 7 o'clock, me and my husband, we're going to be having sexual intercourse. We're going to leave the windows open, the blinds open, so you all can watch. So what are you and your husband going to do? Sit down, or your wife going to sit down and eat popcorn and watch him? And see, that's where the filth of the world has gotten into the church, because in the worldly advice on having the heightened sexual pleasure, what they say is, oh, well, watch sex movies together. Okay, well, what woman wants to think that their husband is fantasizing about the woman on the video or the woman down the street instead of them? Okay? And so it really brings in perversion, and it disconnects people, and they really don't have a good sex life. But because the church is not talking, the only people talking is worldly people, so people are following their advice. Okay? And so here, Matthew 5. And so you just don't, anything that you want to die, don't feed it. Okay? And so I don't do a lot of things. I don't play with myself. I'm not into masturbation. I don't allow other people to play with me or stimulate me. And so I don't really have a big problem in that area. When I was married, I enjoyed sex. If I get married again, I'll enjoy it again. But while I'm not married, I'm not playing with myself. A book of Song of Solomon says what? Don't awake love before it's time. And so there's other people caressing you and whatever foreplay, as well as playing with yourself, masturbation, okay? So Matthew 5, and some people say, oh, we're talking about this in the church. People don't talk about it. That's why people are so messed up. Here it goes. Matthew 5 and 27. You have heard that it was said of those of old time, ye shall not commit adultery. This is Jesus speaking. But I say to you that whosoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, and and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that you that one of your members perish, than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than your whole body be cast into hell. Okay? So what are they talking about? You're lusting, you're looking at this woman, you have a strong, selfish, sexual desire. You're looking at a woman, but you're not touching her, but you're doing something with your hands, and of course you're doing something with your eyes. What's that? That's masturbation, pornography, those type of things. What is that? A counterfeit and destructive purposes of sexual intercourse. Now you get an opportunity to laugh and get informed.